Hello everyone, welcome back to part 2 of painting the cities of Sigmar. In this video I'll be covering the striking yellow and black scheme of GREYWATER FASTNESS. This city is known as a stronghold of sleepless furnaces and industry, dedicated to forging the weapons of war. I hope you enjoy this video and let me know in the comments below what your favourite scheme has been and what you would like me to cover next on the channel. Now let's get into the painting. These are the sub-assemblies that I'll be working with for this miniature, and again feel free to assemble as much as you're comfortable with. First I primed the miniature using Vallejo black primer, but you could also opt to use either white or grey for this. With this scheme using a fair bit of yellow which tends to cover over a lighter primer much easier, I did consider using either white or grey. However, the main body also has a lot of darker colours too, and these would need multiple coats over the white. So I'm not entirely sure which one is the most efficient here. Now the shield on the other hand is mostly yellow, so it made much more sense to me to prime this with a light grey. First of all, I'm going to tackle the yellow areas, and for this I tested a lot of different mixes to try to get close to the box art recipe. And eventually I was happy with around a 1-to-1 mix of Tzimisce Desert and AK Ice Yellow. And for anyone wondering, Ice Yellow is basically Dawn Yellow if you're looking for the closest Citadel equivalent. I was actually really surprised how easily this covered for a yellow, and I think that's largely due to the white pigment in the AK Ice Yellow. And whilst waiting for this to dry, I decided to quickly base coat the trousers using Corvus Black. An airbrush would definitely help to speed up the process with the yellow here, especially if you're painting a few at once, but I just wanted to see how easily this could be done by brush, and it didn't turn out to be too difficult in the end. This was then shaded with a thinned down Avalon Sunset. And this was great for adding some saturation back into the pale yellow, as well as creating some softer shading. I then started to pick out some deeper shading using a thinned down Scrag Brown. Scrag Brown always works really well with yellow, and it's a nice orangey brown tone that's ideal for adding some warmth. And I'm applying this a lot more controlled this time around the edges of the tabard and any recesses, before taking a quick break to block out the hem of the tabard with black. I personally like to get things like this done just after the shading stage, just in case there's any mistakes, and it also helps to keep everything a bit tidier. To further deepen the richness of the yellow, I added an optional glaze of Scrag Brown towards the top of the cloth. I then started to apply some highlights with the base mix of Tzimisce and Ice Yellow. This was a combination of chunky line highlights around any folds and along the hem, and some more softer blended ones along the top and side of the leg where the light could be interacting with the surface. And this was then followed by adding more Ice Yellow into the mix for the subsequent sharper highlights. And after that was all done, I did go back in and make a few minor adjustments with the Scrag stage and just push a bit more shading into places here and there. Now for the shield, I used the same base mix, except this time I airbrushed it over a light grey primer. This was then given a wash using Tzimisce Desert, but you could also use Avalon or any combination of these if you wanted. And again, this is just going to add a bit more saturation back into the yellow. Although this is a wash consistency, I'm careful in controlling it into the recesses and trying not to let it pool too much. This was then followed by a wash of Scrag Brown, again carefully controlling this into the deeper texture and recesses of the wood. And then finally for the deep shade I used Mournfang Brown. And this is reserved for the deepest recesses, so between the wood panels, around the outside of the emblem, and I also used it to block out the trim, although really just a line between the wood and the trim would suffice. I then went on to add some highlights to the shield, starting with the base coat of Tzimisce and Ice Yellow again. And if you're wondering, this brush is honestly way too small for this, as it's almost lost most of its bristles. But normally I just grab whatever brush is at hand at the time and works best for the job, and this was effective enough for what I needed. When it comes to the wood in the GREYWATER fastness scheme, I believe it's actually supposed to be naturally yellow, as opposed to being painted on. So picking out the highlights here, I think I was deliberately being a bit bolder with it, so that the shield would end up a bit paler and more desaturated than the yellow cloth. And this also makes sense if you look at the differences in the yellow on the box art version. I've then continued to highlight the wood by adding more ice yellow into the mix. Once that was done, I went on to base coat the central emblem of the shield, and for this I wanted a slight green-grey tinge to the white, as can be seen on the artwork in the miniatures. So for this I used a mix of Deepkin Flesh and Ulthuan Grey, although you could really use any bright off-white or grey for this. And this was then shaded towards the bottom of the emblem, using a 1-to-1 mix of Celestra Grey and Ironrack skin. To help blend this shading in and add some subtle texture to the shield, I thinned down the base mix and applied some scratches and chips to the shaded area. Before going on to add some deeper shading and dirt around the rivets with some thinned down Agrax Earthshade. Finally, I added a nice sharp white highlight around all of the edges of the shield. Before going on to pick out the rivets using Rhinox hide. I also added a few brighter scratches around the edge of the shield, and carefully picked out within a few of them using some Rhinox hide to add some variation and depth to the scratches. Now, up until this point, I had assumed that the transfers were going to be the same colour as the box art ones, so I was a little frustrated to find out they are actually almost exactly the same colour as the shading that I'd done. And I'm not entirely sure why this is, but it appears to be the case for other people as well. Nevertheless, I continued on applying a layer of microsol to the transfer. This just softens the transfer and helps it to conform to the surface, before applying a coat of matte varnish to help merge the finish with the surrounding paint. By this point, I decided that I'd just paint over the design to try to match the colour with the box art, so I did this using Sons of Forest Green. Now, I know this isn't ideal, especially if you're painting a bunch of these, so if that is the case, I would just make sure that you're a bit more subtle with the shading on the white. Now, once that was done, I added some scratches and damage to the transfer, and then it was time to paint the black iron trim. When it came to this, I decided to use a familiar recipe that in the studio we used for the black metal on the newer Necron miniatures, and it's quite an interesting recipe that starts off with a very dark metallic mix of equal parts Iron Warriors and black. In the Necron recipe we then shaded this using Nuln Oil, however this time I opted to use Rattling Grime, but you could really use anything dark for this, even a thin black paint. Now to highlight this, I'm going to add some Administratum Grey into the base mix at around a 2-to-1 ratio, and this is where maybe the recipe starts to get a bit unusual, adding a regular paint into a metallic one, and actually this works very effectively to create quite a dark and dull looking cast iron. I then added a final sharp edge highlight using pure Administratum Grey. I then added a bit of rust around any rivets and recesses using a very thinned down Scrag Brown. Mournfang, Doomball or any other warm brown would also work well for this. A few final dot highlights of pure white on the sharpest corners, then completed the trim. Moving on to the trousers now, and over the previous base coat of Corvus Black, I started to add some highlights by adding in Mechanicus Grey into the Corvus Black, starting off with around a 2-to-1 mix. I wanted to create a really dark kind of charcoal looking grey, and I also want to bring up the transitions quite softly and smoothly to reflect the softer shapes of the cloth. So I built up these highlights quite slowly, adding more Mechanicus into the mix. This was then followed by a sharper edge highlight of Dawnstone Grey. Now onto the steel plate armour, and for the base coat I made a mix of Vallejo Model Air Silver and Black. I think I mentioned in the previous video just how much I love this paint, and actually it's not just great for highlights. The metallic pigment in this paint is very strong, and actually just adding a black paint into it doesn't seem to dull the metallic effect too much. So by adding more black paint into this, you can actually shade down the silver into a mid-toned steel or even much darker. And that's what I started to do here, adding a bit more black into this base mix to create some softer shadows. Now you can push this all the way to black with just black paint, but I wanted to keep this stage a bit more subtle and then use some inks or washes for the remaining shading. Now something else that I actually found worked really well with this paint was wet blending between the lighter and darker mixes. And wet blending, for anyone who doesn't know, is basically the process of applying two different paints to the surface and then mixing between them whilst the paint is still wet in order to create a smooth blend. This is not really a technique that I tend to use very often, and I never really thought about using it with metallics before, but actually it worked really well in this case and I wouldn't mind trying it again in the future. Once this was done, I started to apply a few quick glazes of Cryptek Armour Shade to build some extra shading and colour. Unfortunately, I think Cryptek has now been discontinued, but there's a lot of different inks and washes that would work well for this. I think Liquitex Transparent Burnt Umber ink is pretty close to Cryptek and has a similar glossy finish. With this done, all that I needed to do was to apply some sharp edge highlights of pure silver. Of course, if you wanted to spend a bit more time here, you could glaze some of the silver towards the top of the panels, but this wasn't really necessary. I was genuinely surprised just how quick this armour was, and how good the end results were. I even added a few extra little chips and scratches to make it feel like the armour was well used. The chainmail areas were painted with the same recipe, except I added some deeper shading with a wash of Nuln Oil before picking out the links with pure silver. It was then time to paint all the rich brown leather on the miniature, and I started off by base coating this with Doomball Brown. I then shaded this with a thin down wash of Rhinox Hide, carefully pushing this into the recesses and contours of the leather. This was then followed by a further deep shade of Rhinox Hide and Black, and this is applied into the deepest recesses and around the rivets. To highlight the leather, I then added Carrick Stone into the base mix. This was around a 2-to-1 ratio to begin with. And this was then followed by a sharper edge highlight with a mix of 1 to 2 parts Doomball and Carrick Stone. I then repeated this recipe for the leather belt and other various straps on the miniature. Once that was done, I then went on to highlight the tabard trim, the boots and the black cloth using a standard neutral black recipe, starting with a chunky edge highlight of Eshin Grey, followed by Dawnstone and finally Administratum Grey. And I'm just going to show this very briefly here as it's exactly the same recipe as the black boots in part 1, so feel free to check that out. I then went on to pick out the yellow trim using the same previous yellow recipe. Adding highlights with AK Ice Yellow. I then picked out a few of the more ornamental metal elements using Runelord Brass. And this was followed by adding some shading with Reikland Flesh Shade, and then finally a quick highlight of silver. Next, it was time to paint the hammer, and again for this I used the same dark iron recipe as the shield trim. Adding some rusty glazes into a few recesses with Scrag Brown. For the wooden handle, I used Thondir Brown as the base coat. And this was then followed by a quick bit of shading with Rhinox Hide. I then highlighted this with a 2:1 mix of Throndir and Steel Legion Drab, painting in some lines for the wood grain texture on the flatter empty surfaces. I then added Administratum Grey into this mix for the further sharper highlights. For the final highlight, I applied pure Administratum Grey for the upwards facing edges. To make it feel like this hammer had been well used, I added some subtle chips and scratches to the surface of the wood using the same mix. Now, I'm only going to cover the skin very briefly here, as I'll most likely make a more detailed video on Patreon, where I have the time to cover this and other methods in more depth. But for the base coat, I started off with around a 3:1 mix of Gorthor Brown and Wild Rider Red, and this creates a lovely warm skin tone that works great as a base coat for darker skin. This is then shaded using a thinned down Doomball Brown, carefully pushing this shading into the contours and recesses of the face. This was then followed by a deeper shade of Doomball and Black, and this is mainly applied around the eyes and the deeper features of the face. I then went on to highlight the face by adding increasing amounts of Ushabti bone into the base mix. I'm building up these highlights towards the top of the forehead, the cheeks, the nose, the brow and the ears. It is often necessary to glaze back around the outside of these transitions as I'm working up in the highlights. This helps to smooth out the blends and reduce the chalky transitions. And as long as the paint is thin, I can go back and forth with this until I'm happy. I really do find faces to be one of the most rewarding parts of the miniature. It adds so much character and story, and because it's quite a small area, it doesn't take too long to paint. This kit in particular has some great looking faces, and I can see myself having to go at a few others in the future. And that's about it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this short series on the Cities of Sigmar, and if you did, then consider checking out the Patreon, where I have a ton of other in-depth painting videos on a range of topics. And again, thank you to these lovely people for supporting the channel, and I'll catch you in the next video.